Hello, this is David Mandell, host of the podcast. We are in the summer and we are beginning our Summer Rewind program. And what that involves is me choosing particular episodes, in this case from season 3, and rebroadcasting those. I'm choosing a couple of, half a dozen or so to get us through the summer until we have new episodes starting in September. And while I think all of our episodes, looking back, are excellent, and certainly I went through season 3, I chose 6 that I thought might be especially relevant or have some theme to them. And this one, we're starting with the Summer Rewind program with episode 3.1 originally. If you're watching me on video here on YouTube, all of the Summer Rewind episodes, because they're from season 3, will be audio only. So you'll find them on Apple Podcast and Google Podcast and Spotify and all that. They won't be here video-wise because we didn't start that until the middle of season 4. Anyway, so the first one here for the Rewind is originally aired of season was 3.1, and that's with entitled Exiting Partners from a Practice with attorney Jason Greis. And I wanted to promote this one because I haven't heard much about it. I speak at a lot of medical conferences. I read a lot of periodicals. I am pretty tied in, as many of you physicians may be, to kind of medical business content. And I haven't seen a lot on the challenge of how do you exit partners when they're ready to retire? How do you do so in a way that is a win-win, that doesn't lead to conflict, doesn't lead to litigation when a partner maybe doesn't want to retire, isn't ready to? How do you make that happen in a way, ideally, that actually it makes it smooth for all parties and actually maybe adds value to the practice itself because you've thought through this and it's documented well. So that's what today's episode is. It's with a great attorney out of Chicago, Jason Greis, who's been on this podcast even before season 3. And this topic, I hope you get a lot out of it. If you're in private practice, this is something you really want to pay attention to.
Welcome to the Wealth Planning for the Modern Physician podcast, where we talk to doctors like you about their real-world lessons in financial matters and hear from industry experts who can impact your personal bottom line. The host of our podcast is David Mandell. David is an attorney, OJM Group partner, and author of more than a dozen books on wealth planning for physicians. Now, let's turn the mic over to David.
Hello, I'm David Mandell, host of the podcast, and today we've got a special episode. We have our first repeat guest. As we are early here in season 3, we've got attorney Jason Greis on, who was on an episode in season 2, and that episode was all about ASCs, Accredited Surgery Centers. So if that's a topic that's of interest, make sure you go back and check that one out. And as we were preparing for that episode, he and I started talking about another topic, which is our focus today, that I thought was, so interesting and something that I know many of you will be interested in hearing about, that I wanted to get him in early in season 3. So I'm going to bring Jason on, let him tell you a little bit about his practice. We will, of course, link to his official bio at the law firm in the show notes, but he can kind of summarize it. So with that, Jason, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. And thanks for having me back. I'm glad I didn't screw it up too badly the first time around. And thanks to the audience for listening in. My name's Jason Greis. I'm a corporate healthcare partner with Benish Healthcare Law. Benish is a smaller national law firm. We've got about 350 attorneys around the country. I tend to focus on corporate healthcare law. What does that mean? I help doctors and hospitals and ambulatory surgery centers and physicians and physician practices with their deals, whether it's, contracting, helping to establish surgery centers, ancillary investments, real estate, et cetera, practice acquisitions, mergers, and healthcare private equity. So that's pretty much what my practice covers, although the law firm covers pretty much the full scope of what you would expect.
Excellent. Yes. And like I said, he's got a pretty impressive bio, and we'll link to that so you can see more of that. And obviously, feel free to reach out to Jason if any of this is of interest. So today, you had suggested when we chatted, said, hey, have you guys had anybody come on and speak about sunsetting partners, sunsetting physicians? And I just like that verb, first of all. You could also use the word exit, but what is this topic? What are we talking about today? What's the issue, big picture, and then we'll kind of dive into a little more depth.
Yeah, what we've been seeing, and I represent a lot of physicians and physician practice groups, is, as the age of the average physician increases, we're seeing what I like to refer to as institutionalization of physicians, in the sense of, if you've ever seen the movie The Shawshank Redemption, the scene at the end of the movie where they kind of laugh saying, I've been institutionalized, and it's hard to leave the four walls of the building. Physicians who've been practicing for 30, 40, sometimes 50 years have a hard time letting go. Lawyers are much the same way. And this concept of sunsetting the physician is to come up with an exit track that lets the exiting physician know what to expect, helps to transition patient care over time, maybe come up with a path to an employment relationship, either a full-time or part-time employment relationship that everyone's excited about, so that you don't lose that leadership, institutional knowledge, patient care for those patients who are obviously incredibly connected to some of these, more senior physicians. And, it also helps to set boundaries and helps the next generation to come up through the ranks, and hopefully to learn from physicians who are getting ready to exit, in terms of finding a mentor of what, how to approach some of the practices, either patient care issues or business issues that the, sunsetting physician probably has seen and dealt with for many, many years.
It makes sense. And when you brought it up, it clicked in my mind because a couple of reasons. One, I know some other professions that deal with this, right? Whether it be law firms or CPA firms, consulting firms, where they had to think through how do they deal with this issue. Very senior people, they're getting in their 60s or 70s. How do we deal with them? How do we do something that's fair to the firm, et cetera, that make economic sense, that is, like you said, that is ideally turns a potentially acrimonious situation into something that's a win-win. I mean, that's the goal, probably, right? And medicine and physicians, I don't think, have dealt with this as much. And so, for some people, it may be, we don't really have a plan yet, So let's talk about, maybe with our lawyers, what our plan is. What have you seen as a trend in practices in terms of this issue? What have you been seeing in terms of exiting or buyouts, et cetera?
Yeah, it's interesting. I started thinking more about this issue 10 years ago, when we were just seeing a lot of litigation around physician exits. And it just, struck me how many practices were on the no plan, which is,
Right.
I think, I think we all have this sense of not wanting to deal with our own mortality, or
Yeah.
moving on in the next sense of our career. And like you said, it's a lost opportunity. Um, in terms of the issue of what trends are we seeing on buy-ins and buyouts, it's interesting. It used to be really common when you had physician practices that were 20, 30 years ago, organized as a C corp, because that's really all there was back in the day. And maybe there were some tax benefits in terms of establishing certain types of retirement plans associated with a C corp. And those days are long gone. And I think the next trend you saw was seeing practices set up as an S corp or a PLLC, and that's how I think most practices are now set up. Thank goodness. But kind of the most recent iteration is, where are the values of practices? Doctors, this next generation of physicians who are coming up, the question that we're seeing a lot of is what does it mean to be a partner? And so they're asking the question of how much is it going to cost me to buy in? When am I going to be eligible for partnership? And of course, the buy-in and buyout oftentimes reflect one another. And so you see, I'll call it the old school, old model, which is very high buy-in, very high buyout. You really don't see that as much anymore unless the practice can, quite frankly, justify it in its particular marketplace. Now, what we've seen is a shift to a very low dollar buy-in and low dollar buyout model. And even more recently, we've seen as kind of a generational shift, kind of I've been working on creating what I refer to as a 3-tier partnership structure, or an accounting firm structure, a law firm structure, where you set up an associate and non-equity and equity partner kind of 3-tiered system, because we're finding that increasingly doctors don't want to be a true partner, meaning they're signing on the dotted line for personal guarantees and taking on the risk, and they're happy just taking home whatever their pay is, plus maybe some bonus, which kind of falls into that second tier of partnership, this non-equity partner, and that's fine by them. So that's kind of the latest thing that we've seen, is this kind of 3-tier law firm or accounting partnership model.
Interesting. It makes sense. I mean, not everybody wants the upside and maybe the headaches of equity partnership. Um, Now, what do you think is driving clients physicians to implement sunsetting policies? Is it they've had a couple of headaches or potential litigation, and they just said, "We got to do better than this"? Are they learning from other people's mistakes? Are there are there lectures at conferences now where people are be made aware of something that you're speaking on? How are docs and what's driving them?
Yeah, I mean, I started thinking about it and speaking on it when I saw, like I said, an increasing number of disputes, which kind of strikes me as silly, because it's, again, lost opportunity versus something that really should be, or is something that's become, as you said, acrimonious. And so what we're seeing is the elder statesmen in the group driving the process and looking for a way to wind down and reduce or eliminate their call coverage requirements, transition patient care, and really get some sort of sense of what income continuity is going to look like for them as they move into retirement and they start thinking about, those sorts of issues and estate planning issues.
So it goes beyond just, hey, this is what you're going to get. I mean, the sort of model that I had in my mind that I've heard people say, well, you can leave when you want, you get 6 months of your receivables and that's it. Right. And it's either you're in, you're out. And it sounds like what you're saying is that there's a desire from physicians, and it makes a lot of sense to, it's not a binary, 1 or 0 here. It could be a transitioning in terms of hours, in terms of part-time, in terms of going from equity partner to just an employed position. It could be for surgeons doing surgery to just consulting. There could be, an element of their clinical responsibilities, that there's basically a pathway created, or maybe multiple pathways, rather than, kind of starting from scratch and doing it on the fly. Is that reflective of what you're seeing, that
Yeah,
all these elements are kind of on the table?
yeah, for sure. And I think, a lot of the disputes came up that I've seen around everyone, practices striking special deals with, the first person, and then the second person's looking for something similar. And then the third person just kind of either rides those coattails or,
Right.
throws some salt in the wound and is looking for something maybe a little bit different. And it just, it takes up a lot of time and administrative effort. And, I think a lot of practices are saying there's really no reason why we can't or shouldn't standardize these sorts of things.
Yeah. I mean, obviously at OGM, we have mostly physician clients, but we have about 20% of our clients are business owners, entrepreneurs. I speak at some of the, entrepreneur organization, Vistage, et cetera, and, speak on buy-sell agreements. And we have one at OJM Group, with my partners, and we have life insurance, tied to it and all that. And what I tell them, and I think this is reflective of what you're saying, is it's a lot easier to hammer out an agreement when neither of you, if it says 2 partners or 5 partners, are near retirement, because
That's
you don't
right.
know which one's going to get sick or which one's going to want to retire or which one's going to get divorced. So everybody's sort of on the same page, and it's not a zero-sum game thinking, right? Whereas you get to the person is retiring, it's all zero sum games. Like every dollar we give them, we don't get, right? It's right then.
Yeah.
And it's much harder to feel good about a deal versus, okay, this is what we're going to do in the future whenever somebody retires. And maybe you might be a partner in your 40s and know, okay, the guys in their 50s are probably going to be before me, but it's not so immediate that it seems like, it's zero sum. Is that a big part of what you're advising
Yeah.
clients to?
For sure, it's better to have those conversations when there's no issue. It's a much easier conversation to have, and quite frankly, with the rash of healthcare private equity transactions that we're
Yeah.
seeing as well, it's much better to sit down and talk with your partners who are on the verge of exiting, because a lot of times they say, "Well, what happens if you guys happen to sell the practice?" And I was here for 30 or 40 years. I helped to build this value. That doesn't seem fair to me that, I get left on the sidelines while you take the value. And so there's discussions around those sorts of issues too. Oftentimes you'll see what's referred to as a clawback get put into agreements that if, a doctor happens to exit within a couple of years after the practice does a sale, that he gets some portion of the proceeds. So, yeah, all good discussions to have.
And I think it all probably also works the opposite way too. Meaning, if you think you're going to be there the whole time and earn out, there might be a clawback of your percentage if you don't practice that whole time. Maybe a health issue comes up and you have to retire. You're not getting the full compensation as the folks who are earning it out over the next 5-7 years practicing. So,
Exactly.
yeah, I was going to ask you that, and I think that's right. I mean, my guess is the increase in outside investment, private equity, et cetera, is kind of forcing some of this formalization because they want to see it. If I'm investing in a business, I want to see that the practice has thought this through, and then we're not going to get into disputes when every doc uh, um, retires. Are you seeing that? Is that something that the investors want to see? They come in, they say, "Hey, do you have an exiting plan? Do you have a sunsetting plan? And if not, this is something we want to see before we close the deal."
Yeah, they haven't specifically asked for it. It's interesting, because I think what happens oftentimes is they take a look at the practice's organizational documents, they kind of nod and they put in place whatever they want to throw on top as their organizational structure. But in all of those instances, there are gating mechanisms for physicians who are coming into the platform in terms of how many physicians can retire at any given time.
I see.
What's the order of payment when you join one of these conglomerated physician practices as part of the platform? And so I think no matter what, if you're thinking about doing a healthcare private equity deal, having these conversations, if it's 2, 3, 5 years out, it's still helpful to think through these issues because you're going to have those same conversations again if you ever decide to go the healthcare private equity route.
Yeah, yeah, the money's going to be want to know about that. So
Yeah.
let's say you're, docs listening to this. Okay, we don't have anything in place. We're a 10-person orthopedic practice, or we're an 8-person, gastro practice, whatever it is. What considerations should a physician sunsetting policy include, and what's involved in developing that kind of policy?
Yeah, and it varies. Maybe a 40-person physician practice might have something that's more robust, or a 100-person physician practice or clinic versus something that's, say, 2 or 3-person physician practice, and where maybe, quite frankly, that's just more of a discussion you have among the partners in terms of what your expectations are going to be. But when we're helping our physicians to think through these issues and create the policies, we'll talk about, things like coming up with a retirement based upon age or a certain amount of tenure. What is the length of the wind down period? Oftentimes it's somewhere between 1 and 3 years. The policy oftentimes addresses things like mental and physical disabilities and how do you deal with them. Call coverage requirements, because one of the benefits that oftentimes the exiting physicians are looking for is to slow down and not provide call coverage. And obviously you have to have a group that's big enough in order to accommodate that sort of request. Decreased or phased productivity requirements usually come up, which also goes to, what does it mean? Are you rounding at the hospitals or skilled nursing facilities or your surgery centers? Are you just doing clinic a few days a week. If you're a practice that has medical directorship fees, what does it mean for that physician's shares of MDA fees? And then, another key point is as you're winding down and retiring, if the practice has ancillary investments like surgery centers, dialysis, real estate, are you going to use retirement or the wind down as some sort of mechanism to exit the physician from those ancillary investments? And the answer may be very different for depending upon the type of ancillary investment. For real estate, for example, oftentimes physician practices allow physicians to maintain their real estate investment well into retirement versus call it surgery center or dialysis, where the intent there is to use those sorts of investments as an extension of your physician practice and to care for your patients. And so oftentimes, both for practical as well as for potential compliance reasons, it's always smart to exit the physicians out of those investments and quite frankly, help to keep the joint venture healthy by then hopefully bringing in some of the younger generations. The policy oftentimes will deal with things like, who's going to pay for the malpractice tail? Does key man life insurance, if anything, look like? And then, again, just having some sort of discussion or reminder about what the covenants are going to be when you leave, whether it's non-compete, non-solicit. So there's a lot to cover, potentially formalize either in a policy or policy combined with maybe some changes to some of the other documents a practice has in place.
Yeah, I want to ask about the documents in a second, but I want to go back to one of the things you mentioned that stood out to me. So you mentioned mental and physical disability. And I think that's, something that is, I think, can be the most difficult and is why it's so important to have something in place before, because, I'm sure there are partners. I mean, the numbers just, have to be thus that there are folks who are dealing with somebody who maybe is having cognitive issues or physical disabilities where they can't do what they used to do, either in full or in part. And, again, trying to deal with that in a way to be fair, because, let's just assume all good intentions, hey, this is a guy who was a partner of mine for 20 years, but we're not a charity also, this is a business and we want to do the right thing. On the other hand, we can't overextend ourselves and we can't set a precedent. So everybody else, it's hard to do that. So it seems to me that would be one that really is important. And especially, as we've just said before, to do this before there's an issue, right? And I mean, to me, that's as important for a 3-person practice as it is for a 50-person practice, because if you're 3 and one of your partners gets disabled or has, a cognitive issue where, they can't do what, you're really in a hard place if you don't have anything thought through, because you want to do the right thing. And yet it's not going to be easy to do it right. I mean, no matter what the good intentions are, if it's not put down in place earlier. So, what do you see? Do you agree with that, A? And what do you see in terms of those provisions that maybe someone here could listen to and get some kind of motivation about?
Yeah, it's much easier. I totally agree with you to become a little bit more disconnected and say, hey, we thought about this, 10 years ago, or when we were doing our wind down policy. And, here's how we decided that we were going to deal with it instead of dealing with it on a one-off basis where everyone's, feeling like they're getting the short end of the stick. So again, I agree with that. And then in terms of how to do it, quite frankly, I've seen different practices deal with it in different ways. Some practices key it off of their long-term or short-term disability policies and say, hey, if you're disabled is determined, by our insurer, then that's the trigger mechanism. Others will say, kind of use the approach of, we're doctors, we know a lot of doctors, let's go out and hire someone who we think is independent to make the determination. And this is, it's not only an area where there can be hard feelings, it's an area where you have to be careful legally,
right,
because of age discrimination and disability discrimination claims as well. So objectivity becomes that much more important.
Yeah, and on the other side, it's malpractice. You can't have someone in your partner, practice,
Absolutely.
continuing to see patients if we don't think they're, cognitively able to do it. So you kind of have risks on all sides. That's why I think it's so important to work this thing out beforehand, because if you're doing it on the fly, there's just pitfalls everywhere. I mean, just it's almost amazing that people could do it, frankly, on the fly and have it, not turn into something that is disputed. I mean, just talking about this now, I mean, between the family that, is perhaps, the doc who's getting exited, but the concerns about liability, but there's also, like you said, disability or age-based claims. I mean, a lot of minefields there.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And you're seeing it in the hospitals too, that hospitals and surgery centers are adding to their bylaws that if you're a physician of a senior age, you actually have to go in for, competency exams either on a yearly basis or as part of a recredentialing cycle. It's kind of similar to, I guess, the DMV requiring you to go in and,
Yeah.
have an exam every year for your motor vehicle test.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, they're obviously thinking about these things. So, just a couple more questions. So, you mentioned the practice's organizational documents. What, does it tie into their articles of organization, if they're an LLC, or their bylaws, or how do you do it? Just don't want to get too much in the weeds because we don't have a lot of lawyers listening. But how do you? Is it a contract? Does it involve the actual corporate documents? How do you guys usually create that?
Yeah, usually it starts with a sit down with the partners to start thinking through these issues, and we'll give them kind of the agenda that I just kind of gave you. And sometimes we're involved, and sometimes we're not involved, and they get back to us in terms of how they want to deal with it. And then, we help them to put together policies, and then we just need to make sure that those policies dovetail correctly with employment agreements, or if they do have ancillary investments and they want to use the wind down policy is a trigger in the ancillary investments, that they're synced up with the ancillary investments. And so it can sometimes be a good opportunity if you've got an organizational plan or organizational documents that are 20, 30 years sitting on the shelf accumulating dust, and dust that was often think through those issues again. So yeah, it's and then also it's a good opportunity to reconnect with your life insurer and your 401k folks, and just make sure that everything is working together.
Yeah, that's often how we get connected in is, hey, I'm doing this. Do I have enough insurance, life insurance? Should I relook at my disability? Do I have long-term care insurance? Because typically even the best practices, the group policies, while they're good and they're helpful, you're going to need your own policy. Know that with disability, and they get that usually early on in their training, but long-term care, et cetera, which often these days can kind of spin off of a life policy, which is great because if you don't use the long-term benefit, then you get it as a death benefit. And if you want to use it during life, you can. So it gives you kind of two bites at the apple. Any last, sort of big picture thoughts on this issue, and then tell us how you typically work with the practices.
Yeah, what, I think that it's we've used the term lost opportunity a few different times, and I think that all practices are trying to differentiate themselves right now from the guy down the road, and it's so difficult to recruit physicians with the staffing shortage and the physician shortage. This can be a differentiator if you do it right, in terms of coming up with a buy-in formula, buyout formula, retirement formula, something that is really shows physicians that you've thought through it, and it can be another key differentiator in recruiting.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, whether the terms are ideal or not, I mean, what does ideal even mean? But I think it's more the fact that, hey, this is a practice that's thought this through. They're not doing this on the fly. They actually think about the business issues, the financial issues, the things that make being a partner easy. Because whether you love it or not, it's done. You don't have to think about it, right? It's that doesn't mean you couldn't influence it, or there's review and kind of changes over time. But versus a practice where it's like, no, we never really thought about that before. Then there's headaches coming, right? especially a young doc coming in. It's like you're going to be the one having to figure it out for the docs who are already there. And that's, stress. So I do agree. I mean, I don't know if fellows or docs would see it, but certainly physicians moving from one practice to another, I think would see, hey, there's a real value. These people have thought through some of these internal issues that can keep things peaceful and moving forward in the right direction. That makes sense. So last thing, if any of the docs listening are interested, they can email you. What's the best way to start a discussion with you?
Yeah, I appreciate it. I'll send you a brief slideshow of talking through and walking through some of these issues. As I've spoken on this many times at conferences, and then doctors can feel free to reach out. My cell is always a good way to reach me, and it'll be in the presentation. But it's 847-977-4383, and then my email, Dave, if you don't mind putting on your website.
Yeah, we'll put that in the show notes, both your bio, which obviously if they go to your site, it has there in your email there. So Jason, thank you so much for being on. I know this is a topic that makes sense, that it's important. And frankly, I haven't heard people speaking about it. So I think we're doing folks a favor, and hopefully some of them get a hold of you.
Hey, no, appreciate it. And thank you for having me as a repeat guest. Appreciate it.
The first one. So that's great. So for all the listeners, thank you for tuning in. And, every 2 weeks, we'll have another episode. If you have an idea of somebody, including yourself as a doc who's listening, say, hey, there's some things that I think I could impart to my fellow docs, feel free to contact me. We're early in season 3, and I'm lining up guests for the rest of the season. And with that, thank you, and tell your friends about us.
Thanks for listening. The Wealth Planning for the Modern Physician podcast is brought to you by OJM Group, a multidisciplinary wealth management firm dedicated to helping physicians build and preserve their wealth while reducing taxes. Podcast listeners can get a free copy of our newest book. Simply text WPPOD to 844-418-1212 and click the link in the reply text to request your free print copy or ebook download. Be sure to join David for the next episode of the podcast. It's important to note that this content is for informational purposes only and does not represent personalized investment advice, as the information may not be suitable for your personal circumstances. Please contact your investment advisor before implementing any of the strategies discussed.